Welcome, everybody, to London Futurists. We're joined today by an illustrious set of panellists, each of whom has a long and impressive biography, which I'm not going to take up time to talk through. Instead, I'll shortly let each of them introduce themselves in their opening remarks, in which I'll also invite each of them to set out what they see as some key considerations about our subject today: options for the future of the global governance of AI. After these opening remarks, which I expect to last up to around 7 minutes from each panelist, we'll have several more rounds of discussion where the panelists will be welcome to challenge each other's ideas if they think that's appropriate, to take various insights into new directions or more deeply, and to respond to any questions which catch their eye that you, audience members, have placed in the Q&A window, where you can also vote for each other's questions. As a brief context, here are some of the questions that I'm anticipating our panelists will be addressing. In what ways should people around the world try to constrain and guide the development and deployment of AI platforms and applications that are becoming more and more powerful? Or should we perhaps avoid any collective attempt to influence outcomes and simply trust the wisdom of the market, the wisdom, if we can call it that, of geopolitics, or the wisdom of any artificial superintelligence that pops into existence? What are the risks involved with various approaches? What are the potential ingredients moving into more constructive, positive angles? What are the potential ingredients of successful governance mechanisms? And which initiatives around the world are looking the most promising? Maybe there are initiatives around the world that you think are likely to fail, or they may have significant adverse consequences. So these are some of the things that I expect the panelists to address, and I'll hand over the floor now to Sean hEigeartaigh from the Futures and Responsibility Programme at the University of Cambridge. Sean.
Thanks so much, David. And it's a real pleasure to take part in this discussion. My work is mostly focused on avoiding global catastrophic risks from advanced artificial intelligence, with a particular focus on the kinds of risks that might be associated with artificial general intelligence or superintelligence, should we get there in coming years. Now, that has long been a goal in the field, right back from the early days, but recent progress in increasingly general systems have made a lot of people more optimistic that we might achieve this in the foreseeable future. In fact, the CEOs of Anthropic, OpenAI, DeepMind, and so forth are increasingly confident they might be able to achieve this in anything from 2 to 10 years, although there's great uncertainty about this. And that puts quite an urgency on governance of this technology. This time 2 years ago, things felt very optimistic to me. Leading companies had established voluntary commitments with the US government with the promise that legislation would follow. And here in the UK, we were in the run-up to the Bletchley AI Safety Summit around this time, which had not only the leading companies there, but also the leading nations in AI, including China and the US, and resulted in further commitments and safety frameworks. But since then, it's felt a bit less optimistic. Voluntary commitments haven't been translated into binding regulation here in the UK or the US. The AI Summit series, to my mind, has diluted its focus away from safety, and leaders at the Paris Summit made pretty clear that safety wasn't top of their agenda. In California, a major bill, SB 1047, was vetoed, although a recent bill was approved. And the Biden executive order, which had some useful provisions around risks of frontier models, got repealed earlier this year. The UK's Frontier AI bill has been delayed for over a year now. But alongside all of this happening, AI progress has continued at pace. So when I spoke about this at the UN's ITU conference this summer, I scrapped the talk I'd been originally planning to give and gave a talk where I said that AI governance is in crisis. To my mind, one of the things that's been a real impediment to the kind of cooperation we need is that AI development's increasingly framed as a race between the US and China. And that's caused it to be intertwined with broader geopolitical tensions between these countries. So my work in the last couple of years has increasingly focused on two pillars, one of which is challenging this narrative, looking at the evidence for various claims, especially the claim that China is actively racing the US towards AGI. But I've been looking as well at how the narrative itself is being promoted by the AI industry, especially in the US, and is clearly being used to push for things that benefit commercial bottom lines. You can see it come up in access to copyright data, arguing against state and federal US regulation, building out energy infrastructure, and pushing for looser environmental laws. The other side of my work has been trying to support channels for cooperation. So I was involved with a couple of people on this call in the Singapore conference on AI earlier this year. And that was great because it brought together scientific leaders from across the world, including from the US and China, to share expertise and develop consensus on AI risk and the progress we thought would be needed for safety. I've been setting up various networks and working groups that bring together both Chinese, Western, and global majority experts, and that brings me regularly traveling to both the US and China. Despite all this, it does feel like we're at an increasing gridlock. China would like to see global governance happening at the UN level, but the US has been increasingly resistant to that. US officials have recently stated that they oppose any global regulation on AI, and international governance itself is starting to feel like it's increasingly bifurcating along US and China centric lines. You've got a cluster of countries based around the US, the OECD cluster, developing kind of ideas and governance norm. And then you've got a cluster around China with the Belt and Road Forum and so forth. It's going to be quite difficult to overcome that under current conditions. But if the last couple of years have taught us anything, it's that things change really, really quickly in this space. Attitudes can shift overnight and might very well do if, for example, AGI becomes seen as a real and imminent thing by leaders, which I think for the most part it isn't at the moment. Another thing that could bring about such a shift is a major crisis. For example, if there was misuse of advanced AI models by non-state actors, that could really underscore the need for international cooperation and regulation. And ultimately, I think neither Chinese leadership or US leadership want to end up in a situation where they might lose control of powerful AI systems. And I think in the right circumstances, there really are meaningful prospects for advancing at least narrow cooperation around safety focused on issues like loss of control and AGI safety, even alongside broader competition across all the applications of AI. Meanwhile, there's the question of what the rest of the world should be doing. My view is that the rest of the world needs to be starting to assert itself and start to demand a table in AI governance rather than just having AI done to it. I think that the right coalitions would carry a lot more power than is normally recognized, and I think there are good prospects there. So, to my mind, there's an awful lot of work for us all to be doing in the meantime to get ready for the opportunities that I think will come. And I think I'll stop there and hand over to the other panelists.
Many thanks, Sean. I will ask you just very briefly, you said that some of the coalitions are looking promising and may have power. Do you want to name any such coalition of countries or activities?
Well, I mean, I mentioned the Singapore process, which I thought was quite a valuable one. It was important because it brought together leaders worldwide, but also Singapore, has a pretty good relationship with China. It has a pretty good relationship with the US. It has a historic track record of brokering agreements on issues like cybersecurity, where it's been hard to get bilateral agreements. So I think that's an example of a relatively small country that's really been able to step up and play a convening role, and that plays a regional leadership role as well in terms of having very sophisticated technology governance. I think broadly, Europe is stepping up in AI governance, obviously with the EU AI Act. I think often we overlook the fact that a lot of the AI supply chain depends on, for example, lenses from Germany and lithography machines from the Netherlands that really underpin the ability to develop the top end chips in places like Taiwan for use in AI in the US.
Thanks. Let's hear now from Michaela Blomqvist, who is from the Oxford China Policy Lab.
Thanks so much for having me, David, and great to be here with all of you today. So I'm Kayla Blomquist, and I am the co-founder and director of the Oxford China Policy Lab. And I'm also a researcher at the Oxford Internet Institute. So currently my research focuses on US-China AI competition, specifically risks stemming from that, particularly related to the amplification of societal risks, and definitely with a strong subtheme of what happens when we inevitably reach highly advanced forms of AI that potentially proliferate in different ways around the world. And my research recently has focused on open source AI development and governance, particularly in China, but as influenced by developments in the US. So today I'll just give a bit more detail on painting the landscape of US-China AI competition first, and then a bit more detail on where the state of open source AI development and governance sits, particularly in China and the US. So I am sure everyone was and still is hearing about DeepSeek, and because of that worldwide media frenzy and even beyond just the media, including the stock market, taking that event that captured everyone's attention, many people's concern, and analyzing it as a crystallizing point. This is a highly visible event in AI development that has really shifted attitudes in different countries in different ways, proving the point that any one development can quickly totally shift the landscape, as Sean was mentioning. This is one of those instances. And in response to that, we of course saw US responses of different but fairly consistent forms between government and industry, framing it as, has China pulled ahead now? What does this mean? Stock market took a big hit. There were investigations amongst US policy communities as well as Congress. There were several congressional hearings on the implications of DeepSeek, China's open source AI ecosystem, and diffusion of Chinese AI throughout the world. And quite a lot of catalyzing happened around what the US's stance was on open source AI development, how it's going to attempt to harness and deploy the strengths that it does have to attempt to counter Chinese influence globally with diffusion of Chinese AI, but also race to a very undefined finish line, which I very much think needs challenging and needs dissecting and saying, okay, what are we racing towards? So from that, around that time, there was the call by the Trump administration for inputs into the US's AI action plan. And we saw many companies from OpenAI to Scale to Meta and beyond making their own submissions and publicizing them quite heavily. And we can see, especially given the timing of that call post DeepSeek, we can see a real focus on how are we going to continue to beat China, at least in rhetoric. And so this brought us to July of this year, where we first saw the US AI Action Plan release, which had a very strong and explicit focus on this is a race, the US plans to dominate it. And then through that, as well as in speeches by President Trump and other statements by officials within the administration rejecting the UN, as well as even the general concept of a global governing authority in AI. And some were very, held this view strongly and suggested that anyone that goes against this is, un-American, very much reinforcing some of the potentially momentum building and a feedback loop within US domestic race dynamics and incentives for companies and individuals as well. A few days later, also amidst the World AI Conference in Shanghai, was the release of China's Global AI Governance Action Plan. And the rhetorical emphasis, at least, is on multilateralism, AI as a public good, and global access to it, and proposed a global AI cooperation organization. For now, a lot of this is very rhetoric heavy, We have yet to see the concrete actions flow in from these announcements, but there are some, and researchers like those in OCPL and throughout the ecosystem are going to keep a close eye on this to see to what extent China's actions line up with its rhetoric. And this is something that remains to be seen. But those listening to China's proclamations of, AI and global goods, global governance, yes, we need to take this seriously in some ways and work with it in ways that will hopefully mitigate many of the risks a lot of us are concerned about, while being quite sober about, the geostrategic moves that are likely to be played. And a lot of this is also motivated by the US's withdrawal from, global goods and the UN more broadly, China stepping up in image and potentially in action as well to take advantage of this vacuum that has been created. So we are, I would say, already very much on a path to fragmented governance systems, and I'm really curious to hear proposals from others on the panel on, prospects for steps towards international and global approaches, which I think are absolutely a must in developing and moving towards, while acknowledging that, especially given the uncertainty about many of the trajectories of where AI capabilities will go and potentially split off in various directions, as well as the potentially increasing focus or availability of extremely advanced models in relatively open sourced forms. And this creates a much more diffuse landscape there are different governance challenges in that if some of these capabilities are available globally and without barrier, and often with great benefit economically and otherwise to global populations, but this also does become much harder to control when we're concerned about loss of control and other highly advanced risks. So this is a landscape that, especially given the focus within the US-China kind of status competition dynamic, even if a lot of that rhetoric is coming from the US, we need to be prepared for not just a couple of entities or countries developing and deploying these models. That is likely to be the case in terms of infrastructure resource concentration still in the US and China. But what happens if some of these models are increasingly widely available and modifiable? So I will wrap up there. I'm happy to get into details on open source policy and governance a little bit later.
Thanks very much. Indeed, we surely come to the open source question, which seems to be a very controversial point. Some of my colleagues over the years who really love open source are horrified every time I suggest that we might want to cut back on open source. Occasionally they change their mind when we have that discussion. We'll see. At this point, I'd like to turn to Dan Fagella from the Emerge Artificial Intelligence Research. Dan.
David, glad to be here. I'm gonna get my timer going as usual. You know me. So I'll try to be as brief as I can here. I'm coming off a lot of great conversations this year. Just got back from Shanghai, discourse with Tegmark and Russell and others, and actually just back from the UN General Assembly. So I'm mostly going to be referencing the ideas of folks who are smarter than me, with different kinds of perspectives, kind of putting on the table some of the ideas from the East and West that I've liked and that I hope are discussed more ardently, but also maybe open with a little bit of where I see the state of affairs in terms of international coordination around AGI. So I will say the following. There was the announcements here recently at the General Assembly of this sort of any kind of coordination around AGI or AI in general is sort of anti-American or what have you. I don't know if those exact words were used, but something akin to that. I had some friends who were really disheartened by this, and it didn't make me feel joyous. But what I will say is it seems to me productive that the idea is on the table. So if I roll back the clock 7 years ago, the last time I was in UN headquarters, there was an event it was on AI risk put on by UNICRI and a couple other divisions of the UN. And, I kind of talked about the sort of things you'd expect to talk about AI risk. I mean, general intelligence, programmatically generated worlds for where Gen AI might go, et cetera, et cetera. The entire event was mostly just about how the biggest AI risk, this is 7 years ago, was that all the code was written by Western males. And that this was the greatest global risk of artificial intelligence. This was sort of my first inculcation to like, oh no, like actually there's times where like this inclusion stuff literally starts to lean into like, we're actually being bad now. Like this isn't good actually. So that was the entire event. It was almost the only thing talked about from essentially everybody that spoke. Going now and seeing general intelligence, seeing Bengio, the Security Council, seeing the whole separate event with the AI Safety Connect, where FLI leadership and Bengio himself and diplomats from Singapore and other places were sort of at least mentioning general intelligence, and in some cases,
That's
really
Joshua Bengio.
Yes, of course. Yeah, sure. For people who want to, anybody unfamiliar with the singularly most cited living scientist, but yeah, good call out there. So to see that talked about so ardently was a very major shift. So it might be like, oh no, we're shut down. I would say now the arguments commence. So clearly any line is drawn in the sand. There's going to be parties on both sides. I actually have some heart here that there is some degree of inevitability of more and more people seeing a little bit more of the risk over time. So I'm not completely disheartened by the posturing, because I consider it vastly better than when there be no discourse at all. So I am heartened by the fact that there be discourse, because I suspect actually that there is no risk ever, no coordination should happen ever, is actually pretty untenable as open-aired discourse commences and continues. So I think of that as probably a good thing. With that said, I think there's many challenges with how to bring that to life. And I'll just bring up two general ideas. So Dean Xuelan of Tsinghua University, which is kind of the Chinese MIT, if you will, has this notion of the regime complex problem, where we have many different kinds of organizations that could coordinate around this. It's not, chemical weapons was pretty hard to get international coordination, but there's way more parties that might be involved here. There's sort of a role for the intergovernmental world, and Xuelan considers that maybe their role is to sort of foster the early dialogues across the table, especially between the East and West here. There's a role with governments directly eventually coming up with some degree of coordination. And there is a role with maybe shared scientific research. I mean, Bengio has talked about kind of a CERN for AI. I'm not saying I agree with the idea necessarily. I'm just saying it ought to be on the table. And then also there's the idea of standards and agreements, in the kind of IEEE type sense between the larger AGI firms. Xuelan talks about how it's probably unlikely that any one of those will be the solution. Often when people say we need coordination around AGI, they assume, well, regulation is the only tool. So everything is a nail, regulation is the hammer. I think there is this menagerie and patchwork of how we can build towards coordination, how we can incentivize to some degree of cooperation. I think coordination broadly is probably the right term. And there's with only having 7 minutes, I would say a very fruitful angle would be beginning to think about the patchwork rather than regulation as the only tool. Not that I'm against regulation. I simply suspect that there is a patchwork at play here. And in the last 2 minutes, I do think that there are uncomfortable and impossible to avoid tensions between the US and China. I'm no pessimist of some inevitable slide into war. There were many of our smartest living human beings during the Cold War just believed, well, it's a matter of time until someone bombs someone and like one country is wiped off the earth. And that didn't end up happening. I'm not going to say I'm an optimist, but I'm no pessimist that conflict is inevitable. But it is, and so it's easy for us here, us primarily Western folks, to sort of listen to somebody who flaps their gums and says, man, everybody in China wants to destroy the West. We need to arm up and yada, yada, and say, hey, that's hyperbole, that's silliness. But I would say if we're committed to black and white being silly, then we would also have to say that the nice Western folks who say things like, man, everyone in China just wants this stuff to go well for humanity, and it's really only the West that yada, yada, we would have to actually be committed to that also being a completely childish opinion. We have to sort of be comfortable with the fact that like incentives are real and the situation is hard. Now, luckily, there are some prominent public sector figures. There's people like Jack Shanahan and Drew Kukor who have been on my various podcasts talking about these kinds of stuff. Shanahan ran the Joint AI Center for the DoD. Drew Kukor ran Project Maven for a great many years. Now he's working at a defense firm, who sort of do advocate for track two dialogue, and kind of talk about this tension in a productive way, where maybe there's ways where instead of channeling this towards war, we can focus on our own adoption and strength of innovation without it being labeled as a Manhattan Project. And we can still aim to open as many doors with China at the same time. So let us be strong without being goading, and let us try to foster dialogue where we can. I do think we can't avoid that tension, and that's 7 minutes for me.
Many thanks, Dan. Well, we surely must come back to your vision that there's more that we can do than regulation. What are the other items in this menagerie? What kind of incentives might there be, rather than sticks, but also incentives, marketplace reputation, and so forth? Let's indeed pick that up. Let's turn now for his opening remarks to Duncan Cass-Beggs from the Global AI Risk Initiative at the Center for International Governance Innovation.
Great to be here. Thanks very much. I'm going to run through a few ideas really quickly. First, around uncertainties and future scenarios. Second, around global scale AI challenges. Then the need for international cooperation. And finally, a little bit on incentives for cooperation that I hope we'll come back to and discuss more. So first of all, in any area where we see rapid change and really massive uncertainty like we do in the space of AI, it's really crucial to ground all of our policy thinking, whether it's at the national or international level, with a reflection on, with a real recognition of the kind of range of the degree of uncertainty and the range of possible trajectories and scenarios we could face. So this just map lays out possible trajectories around just perhaps the most fundamental uncertainty that we see debated daily in the newspapers and in the stock markets, which is really about what are the capabilities of AI going to be over the coming years. And here we kind of lay out the waterfront, everything from the potential stall to a rise, but then a plateau, right through to the kind of trajectories where we could see that AI systems are getting better and better at accelerating progress towards even more capable AI systems. And these are the ones that lead us to what the companies are, claiming to be aiming for in terms of so-called artificial general intelligence or artificial superintelligence systems that potentially reach and then vastly surpass human capabilities across all relevant cognitive skills. In scenario planning, what we do is we take a number of these key uncertainties, the potential values of each of them, we weave them together into a range of scenarios, and we really use that to guide us in designing policy solutions that are ready across a broad spectrum of potential future conditions. You can never predict what's going to happen for sure, but by preparing for the full range of scenarios, one is more likely to be successful in weathering whatever comes at us. So I think that the crucial point that we like to make here, particularly when engaging with policymakers, is that it's not reasonable or responsible to sort of put all one's bets on one scenario or another. It's really a responsibility to citizens to be developing the kinds of policy responses, the kinds of plans that would be robust under a full range of scenarios, while continuing, of course, to update as new evidence comes into place. So particularly when we're facing some of the more challenging scenarios, the ones where we're seeing rapid increases in AI capabilities and potentially not as rapid increases in our ability to control these systems, we find ourselves facing a number of really truly global scale challenges. These are the ones that would cross borders, could involve the common interests of many countries, but probably couldn't be managed effectively by one government or one society alone. So we look at them in three areas: in risks, in benefits, and decision making. But I'm going to focus just briefly on the risk side here. Now, this map lays out no doubt not comprehensive, but a fairly full range of some of the potential and existing, in many cases, harms that we see arising from AI. Now, I want to emphasize, first of all, that this is just the harm side. The benefits are tremendous as well, but we only really get the benefits if we manage to effectively mitigate the harms. And all of the harms listed on this page are crucially important. They need to be addressed, but many of them can and should be addressed at the national level in response to varying, the values that we each have in our societies. I think many of them can be addressed by groups of or coalitions of like-minded countries. But there are a certain set of them that potentially are so kind of global in nature, in scope, and so severe that they are likely to require cooperation among even countries that don't typically like to cooperate. We can imagine some of these that, in the case of the United States and China, for example, they would each see that it would be in their mutual national interest to work together to address some of these. So one of the key examples of that that's being raised in the International AI Safety Report is loss of control risk. Just to briefly go through the key premises of that, fundamentally, it's that belief that artificial superintelligence is technically possible. Maybe it's in 2 years, 5 years, 20 years, but that if it could be possible, it's not beyond the rules of physics that humans could create an AI system that's vastly beyond them in capabilities. Secondly, that so far at least, our alignment techniques, our ability to make sure that these systems are within our control or are acting within human interests are inadequate. And some would argue that it may ultimately be very challenging or impossible for a kind of lesser intelligence like humans to sustainably control a vastly superior one. There's debate around this. Thirdly, that if one did have an unaligned superintelligence, it may develop goals that conflict with humanity. It may just have other goals and humans get in the way. And fourthly, that if an unaligned ASI does have different goals, it may also acquire the ability to physically disempower humans. This is the one example of the kind of risk that if we are confident that it is emerging or could emerge, international cooperation will be required. So let me turn now to the need for international cooperation. There is a lot going on. Anyone who's been watching the international scene over the last few years will look at everything from, what the OECD has done to the Council of Europe to G7 to certain parts of the UN as well, and the recent announcements by the UN. There's a lot of discussion about how do we kind of manage this new technology. Oops, that's my timer, so I will speed through the last slides. But I think it would be fair to say that none of the mechanisms we have in place are yet adequate or even on track to be able to handle the kinds of most severe global challenges that we could face from some of the potential scenarios in coming years. And CG, in cooperation with a number of other organizations, are working on an initiative to put together kind of what the building blocks might be for future international agreements that could actually address this. Crucially, what we're working on is a kind of anticipatory approach. We want to make sure that even when there's a demand and the need for those kind of agreements, that we've done the homework, we've kicked the tires, we know what such agreements, would look like and what kind of mechanisms might be required. I'm going to jump ahead. We can maybe come back to this just to say this is some of the building blocks that we think are important. I would zoom in on the piece around compliance and verification. I know Nora's going to talk a little bit more about that in a minute. Clearly, any international agreement is only as good as one's ability to trust that one's fellow parties are honoring it. Lastly, I think the question of incentives is really crucial that we come to. I believe that ultimately, as awareness grows, there will be incentives for all countries, including the leading AI powers, where they may realize that their own national self-interest is best served by cooperation in a certain number of key areas. So to summary, we really need to prepare for the most challenging scenarios, not only the ones we hope for or expect. We need to prioritize the most global scale challenges that we all face, and we need to figure out how we would cooperate successfully on those, even when the need arises. And we need to really build understanding of the shared interests that could require us all to work together. So thanks a lot.
Thank you. Lots of fascinating points there. I'm sure we will come back to a deeper dive into the building blocks for any successful future international agreement, rather than trying to anticipate which group internationally is going to be the single successful initiative. It's a question of, well, we'll offer these ideas to any initiative any initiative that's listening. Let's hear now from Robert Whitfield from hEigeartaigh, one of the newest organizations in this space.
Thank you very much, David, for this opportunity. The Global AI Governance Alliance, it grew very much out of what Sean was referring to, which was the AI Paris Summit, where we had hoped that it would be building upon the AI Safety Summit at Bletchley, but in practice it turned in a new direction, became the AI Action Summit. It brought in many other countries, and that was something that needed to happen. That was fine. But otherwise, it very much focused on foot on the accelerator and implementation and expansion and development of AI at all costs without AI safety really getting in the room. And so the Global AI Governance Alliance is very much about trying to bring in those other groups that are interested in alliance and addressing their concerns on AI, but they're not safety issues. They're either issues from the global south, equity, they're ethics, human rights. They're sort of business issues from interoperability. So as we've heard, many of these issues can be addressed at the national level, but some need to be addressed at the global level, and they need to be addressed as soon as possible. The UN process is slowly getting underway. We have next July the first global dialogue on AI governance, but that was agreed in principle, 22 months earlier. So it is moving not as fast as the rate of development of AI itself, but we would support that process delivering a good global agreement. But the issues that we've heard about, the issues of global catastrophic risk, they've been on the horizon for some time, but given the rate of progress of AI, they're coming much more close and imminent. And so we need to think sort of possibly specifically, which is what most of the discussion has been on today, about addressing how we would address those risks rapidly. We need to stop the race mentality that's been touched on, and that is certainly evident in the United States. And I know Sean's very valid argument that there's much less evidence, and maybe that it's not the case in China. And quite apart from the grave concerns as to the goal of that so-called race, the very process of a race is one that tends to accentuate progress in power and capability at the expense of safety, and that is what is happening in the States. So if we look at approaches to address AI safety, there are a variety of broad categorizations, but one, there's a group sort of arguing for the concept of a pause, that is a pause to further scaling and increasing capability of AI, whilst focusing on benefiting from the deployment of AI today, the sort of tool AI idea from FLI. And whilst we learn to understand how AI works and develop safe ways to proceed further, if there is a decision so to do. And we could require a developer who wished to get beyond the pause to prove that it is to society's satisfaction that the system that they're offering is safe, and it would lead to an increase in human flourishing. We've heard a lot at UNGA about the concept of red lines. Now, there have been discussions on red lines between the US-China scientists in particular, identifying significant red lines that must not be crossed, particularly in relation to sort of AGI. And now there's a more sort of robust movement getting going. And so that certainly offers, some potential. There's some links in concept to pause, but it's certainly a different way of going about it. There are arguments about instead of sort of touching the brake, putting the foot on the accelerator in terms of AI safety funding. Now, if we're able to get a major shift towards increased funding for AI safety, that would be a significant way forward. There are a series of independent research paths being pursued by the likes of Joshua Bengio, Stuart Russell, Eric Drexler. There's the whole Singapore consensus sort of set of research work. There is the concept of reorganization and the concept of a CERN for safe AI, as we mentioned. So there could be a major focus on safety, or in practice, there could be a combination of the above. But what I think we do need to think, sort of ask the question, what do we want? And you can address that at a detailed level. But if we talk at a relatively high level, the high level argument is that from Alan Turing onwards, and maybe before, people have warned about the implications for humanity if we create entities more intelligent than humans. But that is, as we know, the intent of some of the tech companies today. And these risks are not trivial, they are serious, and they need to be treated as such. So the question is, do we want to reach AGI or ASI, at least in the near term? And I would argue that we do not wish to reach these steps until we have at least understood how AI works, learned to control it, and analyzed what impact further progress would have, and agreed that that is the way that society would wish to go. And I'm reminded of the concept of Icarus. So if you ask the question, how close to AGI or ASI should we go? Icarus was warned by his father not to fly too high, as the wax in his wings would melt, his feathers would come off, and he would crash down. Icarus was thrilled by the excitement of flying. He swooped up and around, but he was not clear how close to the sun he could go. And the key part of the story is that he misjudged how close he could go. His wax melted, his wings came off, and he crashed into the sea and drowned. So I leave you with it, for the moment, with this sort of concept of, if we're seeking not to go at this time to AGI, or you can argue the same thing with ASI, how can we go before, in fact, we've gone too close and we're going to slide into it anyway? Thank you.
Many thanks, Robert. Lots more to discuss there too. I've been preparing a short list. I thought it would be a short list of topics to discuss in more detail, and it's overflowing. So I'm going to have to focus my list of focus topics further. But before we have a second round of conversation, I'd like to hear from Nora Aman from ARIA in the UK, and also some other hats as well. Nora, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. It goes without saying I'm representing my own views here, not any employer I have or had had. We've had some discussions, and there's sort of important questions around, whether there is interest for an international agreement or sort of similar sort of governance or cooperation efforts. There's questions around what those should look like if we were to have them. The thing I want to focus on in my couple of minutes is how we could even implement anything like this. And I think that's an important question, and interacts to some extent with the what and the how, and whether we can do this. The challenge, of course, sort of like succinctly put, is something like what in international relations or game theory we sometimes call an assurance dilemma. So we might be in a situation where there is actually interest by the relevant parties in agreeing to some red lines, some pause, some slowdown, some regulation on how we can use this powerful technology. But the agreement itself might not be enough if we don't have the means to sort of give everyone in the agreement confidence that no one else will sort of circumvent what is being agreed to, because that would obviously put everyone else that isn't doing that and is following the agreement in a worse position. So that makes it tricky to actually get to the place of being able to everyone agree to do this, even if it was in people's interest. So I like to think a lot, so my work is mostly around R&D and how can we make ambitious R&D happen. So when I hear assurance dilemma, I sort of think about, well, what is the assurance tech we should be building today, such that if it comes to the moment that whether you might be interested in implementing something like that, we do have the options. And there's the work sort of that has started to, especially sort of in this last year, there's been more and more work on these questions and how we could implement that in the case of AI. I'll dive into that a little bit more. I just want to first do a short sort of historical analogy with the context of nuclear. So nuclear, obviously, you'll all be familiar with this, is a sort of dual-use technology because we have civil uses of nuclear for energy, but we also have sort of military and offensive uses of nuclear technology. And as humanity, we went sort of through this challenge, which is a lot of similarities with the challenge we're facing today. And we did successfully, or somewhat successfully at least, arrive at a nuclear non-proliferation treaty. And the sort of monitoring aspect of this was an important aspect. In the case of nuclear, the kind of key ingredient that needs to be monitored and understood is uranium. We can distinguish between highly enriched uranium that is actually fit for making nuclear weapons out of it, and less enriched uranium that we only can make energy off. And then that's kind of the dividing line where the monitoring efforts really had to focus on and make that distinction. And there is sort of, physical traces in the world. We can sort of go into enrichment facilities and look at how much is the uranium enriched, and that has become one of the key pillars of being able to arrive at and enforce the nuclear non-proliferation treaty. So in the case of AI, we then want to ask, well, what could that be for AI? Like how could we monitor that compliance with and enforce any agreements that we might want to have about AI? And the work I've and many others have been focusing on is that compute. So that's kind of the hardware, these AI chips, these AI accelerators that are used for large training runs that might actually take a similar role as uranium in the nuclear case. So it's a sort of very condensed supply chain for compute, and compute is sort of a necessary ingredient and an important necessary ingredient for AI. Unfortunately, it doesn't have the property of being sort of easily physically observable what is happening. So if you today would step into a data center, you do not know, you do not see what sort of computations are going on. So that's tricky, and that's sort of a disanalogy with the uranium case that I've given just before. But on the other hand, what is interesting is that sort of the tech stack that AI is built on, can sort of implement complex universal sort of computation. So that, I think, is actually an opportunity for us. So some work I and many others have done is looking into how could we equip the AI tech stack such as to enable privacy-preserving verification of claims. So the basic idea here is you have different actors. They would like to make high assurance, high confidence claims to each other about how they are using the compute, and how do we need to equip either AI chips or data centers such as to make that easier. There's different paths you could go. I've done some work on how could we sort of equip AI chips themselves. There's other work thinking about at the data center level, what could we do to like make verifiable claims about what is happening in that data center? And there's obviously many other steps along the sort of AI supply chain where verification is necessary. But I think one, given the scenarios that other people have talked about, and like we don't quite know what's going to happen, we don't quite know whether we want any form of agreement, but it seems good to have the option. Sort of, I'm a strong defender of investing now quite heavily in building out that tech stack, and there is a certain opportunity that we are today, we're arguably today undergoing sort of the largest, historically largest infrastructure build out in terms of data centers. There's many billions of US dollar flowing into AI data centers. They have not all yet been built. So there is still an opportunity to sort of differentially affect how we're building out this capacity to allow actors to make verifiable claims to each other. And the last point I want to make in these few minutes is just that this is interesting from an international governance perspective, but it's actually not the only reason or the only value that we can get from having a privacy preserving verifiable tech stack for AI. There's many other types of actors that would like to make verifiable claims to each other. A data center might want to assure a model provider that they're in fact executing the training load that the model provider was intending to execute. An end user would like to know that they're in fact being served the model that they have claimed to be served. Regulators or overseers would like to have privacy preserving ways to test, to look at evals of these models and know that they have, they don't have certain dangerous capabilities. That is in the interest of many actors in this space. So I think there's some hope here that actually there's some convergent interest in building out that technical capability, and that could enable sort of wider diffusion of safe diffusion of AI capabilities for more broad public uplift. I'll leave it here. Thank you.
Many thanks. That was very interesting as well. I'm going to now ask everybody to come back, try and limit comments this time to 3 minutes each, which I think is very hard. You've probably got your own ideas, each panelist, as to what you'd like to reply to disagree with, or to extend further. I put 13 comments in the chat, which is clearly far too much, but I think each of these are fertile ground. I'm not going to read them all out now. There's no need for you to read them out unless you to look at them unless you're stuck for ideas. And I've included one question which Peter Scott has raised, which maybe would be more fruitful if we got companies such as Google and Microsoft to lead the cooperation rather than leading it to international politicians to lead. So let's go around again. Sean, back to you.
On Peter's comment, I do think that some of the best leadership we've seen over the last couple of years has come from some figures within the tech industry. So Demis Hassabis has been calling for international cooperation. Some key ideas like safety frameworks came from within the industry. And so, certain people and groups have played really important roles there. I think we can't rely on companies only to sort of push this in the right direction. I mean, we're seeing like significant shifts even in the positions of some companies. So, if you look at what Anthropic CEO was saying back in 2018, he was talking about exactly that a race between the US and China would be the most dangerous possible situation in which to develop AGI. Whereas this year he's saying, well, we need to win the race with China. So I think changing positions and a changing competitive situation is going to affect, what companies can do. So I think increasingly there's going to be a critical role for people who can aim to be independent and can actually say, what they think is the right thing to do, as opposed to being kind of constrained by various sorts of commercial pressures. And it really is remarkable at the moment how much the race narrative is being sort of propagated by various parts of industry, and how much it is being used to justify literally everything under the sun that you could think of that benefits the industry. I've seen it used for opposing regulation that would protect children, laxer environmental laws, energy rollout, state regulation, federal regulation, access to copyrighted data. I mean, the list just goes on. And we're increasingly seeing the establishment, not only of kind of policy lobbying groups within the companies, but things like super PACs. Several have been announced in the last 6 to 8 weeks that basically say they are going to push hard to support political candidates who are pro-innovation and push hard to make life more difficult for people who are in favor of things that might slow down the companies. So I think to the extent that is at all possible, there needs to be a counterweight to that. Now, I still expect there to be individuals within the industry who are very much doing the right thing, but I think we do have to recognize the incentive structure that commercial entities are operating under.
And have people acted on that fine paper that you wrote on this isn't as much of a race as people are trying to pretend it's a race?
Well, so a couple of interesting things have happened. I mean, one, I don't want to. I am on a public podcast right now. I will say I've had a number of quite interesting conversations and meetings, including with people who I wouldn't have expected to, bodies of the U.S. government who I wouldn't have thought would be as amenable to these arguments as it turned out they were, and people within the commercial sector. So I found that very promising, and maybe times in future I'll be able to speak more publicly about it. But I do think in parallel, there's been something happening in terms of the present US administration's stance compared to the previous one. I think there's been a lot of coverage now that indicates that the previous administration was very much taking the idea of AGI seriously and was seeing this as something that the US government had to sort of make sure that the US got there first before China. And a lot of strategies such as increasingly wide-ranging export controls on chips and models seem to be supporting that. There seems to me to have been a considerable shift over the last year towards an export the American tech stack strategy, involving kind of making sure that everybody builds on the American technology stack. That to me is may reflect more skepticism about AGI being a near-term thing. And some people like Sir M. Krishnan and others have come out and basically said they think, this idea of near-term AGI is, flawed and has caused a lot of harm. And if you don't think AGI is coming in the next couple of years, then the present strategy actually makes a lot more sense, because if what we're looking at is more like the internet, then you want everybody using your protocols and your technology and so on. So I think that there's an interesting thing happening in parallel where the scientific view or the scientific vision of the yes, at least some of the present administration reflects a different expectation of what's coming than the previous one. So it's going to be really interesting to see who's right.
Very thoughtful. Kayla, back to you. What would you like to build on?
Pick up on a couple of Sean's points on challenging the race narrative, but try to touch on open source as well. And I think when it comes to trying to bring at least more nuance to the, frenzy around the race narrative, there are two, I think, approaches that are quite valuable. The first being really high quality research and based on, genuine conversations and in on the ground experiences, especially in China, about what are the attitudes of the key developers, policy actors, and broader public in China around AI and prospects around AGI and what truly is happening, and presenting that to a Western, especially US audience, to bring more clarity and understanding in detail to back up some of the claims that China's not racing towards a specific version of AGI. I think that a number of us are working on research to eliminate those things. And then on the other side, heavily focused on the US, but very much not exclusively, is really pressing anyone that is saying we must win the race to define where is the race taking us? What are we racing towards? How do we know when we've won? And just very consistently making them not, continue on such rants without answering some of those questions in detail and with some clarity, and especially in the context of U.S. domestic politics these days. Some of the stances and the rhetoric at the administration level may not be representative even of the voter base that they're trying to speak to. And that is also worthy of more surveys and research. But I do think that there's a sense amongst the American public, but not yet articulated or being able to place a finger on, is we have a sense that this is not happening in the broader interests of the American public, but it hasn't been crystallized yet. So I think those are really productive ways forward. And tying this to the open source point, especially in China, I also think the reasons for really good, research and on the ground experiences over there is actually experiencing there's just a very organic and genuine enthusiasm about what different forms of AI can do for economic advancement and other, interests that people throughout society have at the individual level, the corporate level, and the government level. And no, I totally agree that there really is a huge lack of emphasis on beating the US, but there is a really strong push that comes from competition within the domestic arena amongst AI developers there of just trying to make it, to be honest, and needing to have a bit of clarity on what their incentives are, even if that's just to continue having a job or being able to raise funds. And, a number of people have touched on incentives throughout this conversation, and I think that's a really important layer as we think about the speed with which and approach with which various actors in the Chinese ecosystem will be behaving within. So I'll leave it there.
Many thanks. Sean was slightly indiscreet, but wasn't specific in suggesting that some of the contacts he has within the US administration might not always entirely believe the party line. Do you have any similar insights as to people privately being more concerned and more thoughtful than they might publicly appear?
Definitely. I mean, at the administration level at this point, there is, especially as we've seen with the contradictions between where the US government has broadly gone with export controls on semiconductors and the Trump admin's, somewhat chaotic dealings with NVIDIA and changes of mind on that front. So I think there is a question of, is there a party line on some of the really important details here? And beyond that, we've also seen, we saw the proposed moratorium on state level legislation on an AI regulation that did not pass. We don't know if it will try to make a comeback at this point. But having spoken with a number of people who were very involved in, voting on that and coming to conclusions there on both sides of the spectrum politically, the disagreement was not so much that, oh, we need regulation, throughout Congress. It was we disagree on how to get there. We disagree on at what level of government, like the federal government versus state level, should this occur. And if we do agree, at least this group of us, politicians or policy actors, if we do agree that something is needed, how do we get there? And that actually is where some of the fragmentation came from, at least a few months ago that I saw.
Thanks. Dan, what would you like to add here?
Yeah, sure. I'll build a little bit on incentives and some of what we're talking about in terms of heartening/disheartening dynamics with China. So I do think that we are seeing incentives bend the leaders of the AGI labs in extremely predictable ways. And I honestly think it's very, very silly for people to think that you could find someone who isn't primarily sort of going to be acting on incentives. I think the reason we're having this conversation around coordination is because if you could simply find saints and then give them scepters, then we would just find the people walking around with halos and they would eternally act in our best interests instead of their own, and that would be it. But as it turns out, that's not what the founders of America or Venice or anybody that's seen how governments collapse and tried to handle these kind of problems has handled them in any sustainable way. But that does mean kind of frankness around how incentives work across the board. So I think it's completely safe to say that the lab leaders are very predictably saying, well, maybe we do need to win against, whatever, right? If Dario's the one guy that isn't vacuuming up funds by towing some kind of party line or doing what behooves the build out of his gigantic data centers, then he loses. And so this is a structural incentives problem. Some people will say, well, Dario has become evil. Well, Dario has become corrupted. I would just say incentives are real, and the incentives bend him in that direction. And I think most of the people who criticize him would be doing the same things he's doing if they're in their shoes. Now, of course, everyone says they wouldn't, right? Everybody goes back in time and they pick who we now have conceived to be the good guys and bad guys and say, well, surely in all of those circumstances, I would have been the good guy. I consider that an exceedingly disingenuous position to have. And I think that extends to policy as well. I think to say, well, these AGI labs, they're turning down, like they're going against things that would protect children. I think, I don't know the details of that particular policy stuff, by the way, but I think it's like to say, if we pass this, children would be protected. All you have to do is sign this and kids have better lives. And if you don't sign it, well, clearly they won't. Well, I don't think that's true either. I think for us policy people, our bent would be to say, why surely the policy suggestions are always good. There aren't any flaws in our motives. Why we're not driven by these base desires of these people. But I think, the people not doing the building are fighting for power and influence in other ways. No, I'm not calling it immoral. I'm calling it amoral. So I believe incentives are amoral. And so I think we have to be frank about the fact that, yes, the labs are being bent left, right, and sideways, and the policy people are going to frame themselves as the saintly, selfless ones as well. And this is why I believe we need a lot of voices in the room. This is why I admire the founding of America and Venice. I think sort of understanding the inherent self-interest of man and being able to bound that, I think, is really, it's got to be the game we play. And I think if we say that it's just the lab leaders that are susceptible to these things or exhibit human nature, I think would seem to miss the boat. On the China side, I think it's a lovely thing that we're seeing less rah-rah, shish-boom-bah beat the United States, at least publicly from China, right? The Wake conference, spending 5 days in Shanghai, I really didn't pick up on that at all as kind of the general tenor in the side conversations, in the smaller rooms, in the bigger rooms. I didn't pick up on a lot of that. But what I will say is, talking to the very few number of AI safety people in China I was able to find, and just discourses with folks who sort of live there, it does seem far less common in China than in the West to both work at a company working on AGI and also blog post and tweet and discuss openly the potential downsides and need for coordination. There is a much more stay in your lane, a much less, like you can work at DeepMind and you can have a 75 tweet thread about all the interesting thoughts about how AGI could go wrong and what you're thinking to do about, making sure that doesn't happen. And you wake up the next day, you still get a paycheck. You still get a paycheck. You can go to events for AI safety, you still get a paycheck. I get the sense in China, I don't know if you're getting a paycheck. I don't know. So I actually think we see some lovely, delightful, less Warhawk energy from China. Great. I mean, if you guys will remember, after Mao, when there was Deng, he intentionally kind of laid low until he was powerful enough, right? So we're playing this game where we're saying China not doing Warhawk is due to the inherent higher quality of their moral fiber. I'm not calling it worse. I'm just saying, guys, this is probably circumstantial, but it is still nice that they're not being Warhawk. It should be worse if we were both that way. But I will say the grassroots element feels vastly more suppressed out there. And I think if there are efforts to kindle not just track 2 dialogues with diplomats, but boots on the ground engineers. There's smart people at DeepMind who are talking about the downsides. God, it'd be beautiful if there could be smart people at DeepSeek who could be on a webinar and hash out those ideas too. But I actually see very little of that kindling on the other side of the pond. And I do think that we may underestimate how much intellectual freedom we have here to kind of question the path we're going on, even if that's where we get our paycheck. I don't think that happens in China. We need to bear that in mind. That's all I got.
Fascinating. So we shouldn't rely on finding saints, nor should we even rely that China isn't apparently erasing us currently, because they may flip over. So we're going to need better mechanisms than that, such as the mechanisms we've all been discussing. Duncan, what would you like to say next?
Okay, well, a few points. Maybe I'll touch on benefits, the question of the pause, and then come back to incentives. So, I mean, first of all, I want to come back to Robert's point about like what do we want here, and because we spend a lot of time about talking about what we don't want, we probably don't want the type of AI systems that we can lose control of and that really pose, globally catastrophic risks. That's not in anyone's interest. But I think what we do want is really to harness the full potential that AI has to bring for across the board in terms of cures to diseases and new scientific breakthroughs and just potentially unprecedented growth in prosperity. And I think, drawing on Anthony Aguirre and others who've really made the case that we could achieve tremendous productivity leaps just by focusing on really reliable, narrow AI tools, systems that are not agentic and generally far exceeding humans and competing with us, but actually systems that we can rely on to help us work better and achieve better outcomes. Now, I think in that world, the market can take care of a lot of that. Particularly as we kind of see the diffusion of those technologies and of the benefits of them. But there may be a role for international cooperation around some elements there where there are market failures in ensuring widespread access to these technologies and in ensuring that the benefits are widely shared. And we deal with some of that in our work on the building blocks. I think another goal that we would have for humanity that we may want to consider pursuing as part of some kind of international agreement is just being able to have a wise and joint reflection on questions that fundamentally affect us all, such as when and under what conditions do we even want to bring into existence, or might we even want to bring into existence AI systems that are vastly beyond us, particularly when we're talking about systems that could be essentially, succeeding us as the dominant life form. That's a very big choice. It may be somewhat irreversible. Right now, those choices are being made by default by a few people at some leading AI companies. And without thinking that we can get to perfect global kumbaya on these questions, I think we can do a lot better than the current status quo and actually figure out the mechanisms to have informed, deliberative conversations on this, but especially make sure that we've got a reasonable amount of time to have that reflection. So I want to come next to the question of the pause, which could be one of those elements that we may need to precisely to buy us that time. There is a lot of debate about whether a pause may be needed and whether it may ever be needed. And by this, I mean a pause on particularly creating artificial superintelligence and potentially the precursors to it. I think it's a healthy debate right now. There's a recent book out, If Anybody Builds It, Everyone Dies, that argues that in fact we've reached a level of technological maturity now that would already require us to stop. We're already at the kind of precursors to ASI. Others would argue, no, we've got a fair bit of road ahead of us. Obviously, take Robert's point about Icarus very seriously. We don't want to go right up to the edge. I think a reasonable position on this would be that whether or not you believe that we require something now to be enacted to prevent the creation of systems that threaten potentially global scale risks. There's a very strong case to be made that what we do need to do now is the homework that would design and even put in place the mechanisms so that even when we found ourselves in a situation where we needed them, we kind of have a turnkey where we can say, we know how it would work if we had to actually say, whoa, red line on these certain issues. Finally, I just want to touch on incentives. I think people have spoken about the debate, the very healthy debate that's going on in DC and in other capitals right now in the world. I would agree that there are, that particularly in the USA and a few other countries, there's some very smart people doing the game theory, doing the red teaming, thinking through what the implications of certain scenarios would be, and what are the conditions under which going for the win is not necessarily going to be in the best national interest, and where there may be a need for deals with other countries. I think that work is really important, and would just encourage that to be pushed forward, so we're sure we're ready. But the last thing I'd say is, and this is somewhat promising, is I noticed that the group here in this discussion today were from a relatively limited number of countries, but I do think we're starting to see the beginning of a kind of much broader global conversation, recognizing where our shared interests may lie when it comes to the future of AI. I, like some of the others here, are recently back from UN, where I was speaking with representatives from a very wide range of countries. A colleague of mine is just back from an AI summit in South Africa. And I think there is a growing recognition that the potential benefits that we could get from AI are so tremendous that we all have a shared interest in not squandering those by allowing kind of certain aspects of AI development to go off the rails in ways that could threaten the benefits and could threaten us all more broadly. So I'm encouraged by that, but I think that is something we all need to work to build as well, as that make this truly a global conversation.
Lots of interesting points there too. But let's hear first from Robert, then we'll go to Nora, and then we will try and have one more quick round of final thoughts, even more quick fire. But Robert, the floor is yours.
Okay, a couple of points. First of all, just following on my Icarus analogy, so there is the question of how close are we, and this has been touched on a bit. In practice, Sam Altman and Elon Musk did say 2025. Now, let us hope there's a good deal of AGI hype in there, but obviously it's being put across that it is very close. And I was very struck in a different way of saying things. Craig Mundie from Microsoft, or formerly from Microsoft, he had an article with Tom Friedman in the New York Times a couple of weeks ago. And there they were talking about the analogy of looking at three epochs: the epoch up to the date of the printing press, when they saw that as when the analogy was ice, and then there was a phase change with the printing press, and that took us to the age through the age of information and then they were saying at the beginning of 2010s, the age of intelligence, and there the analogy was the water was going to turn to vapor and seep into every product and be absolutely everywhere, and it was being described as an irreversible technological change where intelligence filters into everything. Now, that's not exactly the same definition as AGI, but it is this concept of a huge irreversible change that has not been brought upon by us. It has been brought on by the tech companies. Gives me grave concern. We should be discussing as a sort of global society how we wish that society to develop. My other point was what we haven't really touched on is the civil issue and the military issue. It was noticeable in New York 10 days ago. So you had two debates. You had the long planned debate in the Trusteeship Council on Thursday at 3 o'clock for 3 hours, which was talking about this process that's been gradually generated, leading to the scientific panel being appointed and the launch of the global dialogue on AI governance, which first of which is next year. And that was delivered robustly, started off by the the new president of the General Assembly. And at the very same time, you were having a debate which in practice started the previous day and went on for 7 hours of the Security Council discussing AI in the context of defense and peace. And my point is that really almost all our conversation up to now appeared to be in the civil domain, but with these existential risks and the grave catastrophic risks, the risk, there can be just the same risk of development in a military environment as in a civil environment. And so by closing down, let's suppose we had solutions in the civilian context. If we didn't have solutions in the military context, then we haven't achieved very much. So we really have to address both at the same time.
As if matters weren't complicated enough already. And on the subject of timing of when AGI is likely, I think the point was made well before by Duncan, I think, that it doesn't really depend on how confident we are that it will be soon. The point is that there are at least some reasonably credible scenarios in which it might be coming soon, in which case, even if people say, well, it's not entirely sure, that's no reason to back off.
Yeah.
Nora, what would you like to pick up?
Cool. So Dan mentioned earlier this sort of idea of a patchwork of different, types or forms of coordination, and I want to emphasize one more that has come up a little bit, not as much yet, which is I think would be really valuable, and we should ramp up a sort of shared efforts of sense making, shared effort of like understanding what is going on and developing a shared vocabulary and understanding about that. So one concrete example here is I think there should be sort of more international or shared bilateral or multilateral efforts, just studying AI systems and studying questions of AI risk and AI safety, because someone in the chat said it's game theory all the way down, and I sort of like directionally agree, but it's hard to coordinate, even if there's sort of coordination options of much shared interest, if your sort of understanding of what the payoff matrix is pretty different. So I think it's important that we study these questions of how will the capabilities be unlocked as we go on? Are these systems already or seemingly showing sort of concerning emerging behaviors? What does the use of these AI systems look like in the wild? These questions need to be studied, but I think they need to also be studied together, such that we develop shared understanding of these questions. That's definitely important when it comes to the question whether or when we need anything like a red line or a pause. But it is also important when it comes to the question of like what should the red line be, or what would be a productive agreement be, and without having that shared understanding, that will be really hard. And I'd love to see much more shared effort towards this.
So as well as focusing on technical engineering, building out the tech stack, as well as focusing on the policy engineering, figuring out what policy levers might be invented, we have a shared task in narrative engineering, this shared sense making. And we
science.
Humans, yeah, science, yeah.
Narrative/science, just like understanding what these AI systems are doing.
Right, yes. We humans are motivated by stories. The Bible's full of parables. People who can tell anecdotes often get more followers than people who come up with the dry academic form. Now, the audience has been unusually quiet today. Usually they've got a whole bunch of questions. I think it's because the conversation on the screen has been so utterly riveting. There's been so many ideas, so most people have just been content to go with the flow. But I'm going to ask each panelist to very briefly offer some final remarks. If there's something that's already on your mind, then go through with that. Otherwise, you might offer either your biggest worries, things that you think are problems that we haven't solved, or your biggest ground for optimism, whether you like the AI Red Lines Initiative or something else that you think hasn't been spoken of enough yet. And we'll go around in the same order again. Sean.
I want to pick up on a couple of things. Firstly, to a question that's just come up, I think the network of ACs holds a lot of promise, but I'm personally disappointed that China has been excluded from it, which I think undermines some of the biggest promise that could hold. I would love to see a future in which China is a part of that, so that standards and best practice on safety are shared across all the leading actors. Um, I've strongly agree with the vast majority of what Dan said today, so I feel a bit by like talking about some of the things where I slightly disagree, but I did want to pick up on a few of his last points. I do think on the grassroots element in China, Dan's pointing to a real thing, but perhaps slightly overstated. And I think the difference between I think what we have in the West is also a real thing, but slightly, I don't know, overstated in the other direction, perhaps. So one thing I think is the case in China is that it's just not as much part of the norm to kind of publicly talk about societal impacts and risks of technology in general. This is not a specific thing to AI. A second thing is that I think actually thinking deeply about risks is a newer phenomenon in China. In the West, we've had this really well-funded kind of philanthropic, academic community thinking about risks that has had a lot of engagement with some of the leaders, and that's been going on for a decade. And so, in some sense, it's not a surprise that a lot of this thinking is a little bit newer in the Chinese case. I do think there are people who are speaking their mind. One of my colleagues in China likes to point out that nobody from the Chinese government's ever told him what to say. The only one who's ever given and told him what to say was the UK government when he came to Bletchley. They gave him a script, he tore it up and said, well, he wanted to anyway. And he also went and spoke at the UN Security Council and called for a bunch of things that definitely weren't, Chinese government policy on cooperation on safety and not using AI in the military. Um, Meanwhile, we can look over at the US and talk about how free everyone is to say whatever they want until we learned that Daniel Kokotalyo had to give up, or at least had to run the risk of giving up 85% of his family's net worth in order to speak negatively about OpenAI following his departure. It took him taking that risk and an investigative journalist uncovering the disparagement agreements to find out that actually everybody who was leaving OpenAI, many of whom had serious concerns about the company's safety practices, had their hands tied by a legal agreement not to speak badly against the company. I think there's a lot more kind of hard stuff and soft stuff that constrains people in the West as well. And I think in the same way that Dan talked earlier about blacks and whites, and we need to recognize that there are shades of gray on every side of this, hence the need for independent thoughts. To quickly sum up, we've talked a lot about global governance. I want to talk about a couple of, I think, key underlying ingredients. One is the kind of toolkit that Nora and others are working on. I think that's absolutely critical. The more tools we have to trust but verify, as they say, the better chances we have of coming up with serious agreements. Another thing is going to be transparency. A bunch of the most promising governance proposals I've seen in the West, like Dean Ball's recent one, it's in SB 53, it's been rumored to be in the UK Frontier Bill, involve transparency, being able to actually see what's happening in the companies. What are their best models? What are the safety practices around those models? Because otherwise we will end up in a critical information asymmetry situation where the only people who really know where the frontier is and how safe it is and what the practices around that are people within the companies who may or may not be able to speak freely about it. So transparency is critical. The last element, I think, is cooperative networks, because if we do see kind of geopolitical tension ramping up, history tells us that incremental networks of trust, even on limited things, form a foundation that we can then build bigger things on. That can be at an academic level, it can be a company to company level. And I know, people at some of the Chinese companies we've talked about today are interested in talking to their counterparts in Western companies, and some of that is starting to happen. Like all of these things play a critical role in establishing the small but incremental trust steps that then allow us to move more quickly on bigger things when the moment becomes right. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thanks very much. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done to get this policy environment working properly with verifications and trusting. But we shouldn't be surprised because a heck of a lot of work that's gone into the technical side. If even just a fraction of the work that's gone into the technical side was applied to solving the policy and verification side, we'd be in a much better state. So we shouldn't despair that it's difficult. We should just seek to get more good brains applied to support that. Kayla, do you have some comments to chip in?
Yeah, I think I'll close by attempting to characterize something I think each of us panelists have touched on in a different way, and that hopefully weaves together, the need for innovation in a policy, in a hardware/technical sense, and also in a narrative sense is, I think, what we need to take the concept of, the layered approach to like national and international regulation and expand that to consider weaving the social and technical fabric that will keep us, kind of serve as guardrails and bumpers to keep us on a risk mitigated path. Within that, I'm thinking a bit about tendencies in the public discourse, whether that's policy or media or more broadly, around some of these, these partial solutions or these innovations that many in this room are talking about and working on, taking, on-chip verification as one example of this. Innovations here are so important and will absolutely be a fundamental piece of the puzzle. And I think that everyone here on the panel is acknowledging of that. But the tendency in the broader public discourse is to paint some of these things as proposed silver bullets and then say, oh, it's a failure if it did not serve as a silver bullet. And so within, broader public-facing conversations around these things, I think just having a very conscious effort to push back on that and say, this is one of many threads within the broader social and technical fabric that we need to bring together. So I'll close there.
Wise words. Dan, what is your wisdom to finish with?
Yeah, I'll be super brief here. I totally agree with Sean's take here. I mean, again, I don't reserve my there is no black and white for specific favored categories. I consider the world to be wildly and unendingly gray in absolutely all directions beyond even my conception or possible imagination. I think that there are some hindrances to discourse in the States. I would still like to, so certainly I'd like companies who work or folks who work for big labs to not have to take gigantic financial risks to speak. I think there would be a lot more Daniel K's if there weren't some sneaky, weird stuff going on there with contracts. I'd like to see absolutely more grassroots from China, though. I think the Confucian whole, as the emperor's breeze blows, the grass bends kind of thing. There's a very one-way street there in terms of kind of communication and power governmentally. And the consequences for sort of pissing off the wrong people in China are, I think we can all admit, slightly more severe than those in the United States, if we're super honest with ourselves. But regardless, gray all around. Stuff to fix for the US. I don't think everybody at DeepMind with concerns is voicing them. Absolutely not. And in fact, I think when they are, they're muting them because incentives still rule the world. But at least they're tweeting. They're still getting a salary. I think there's something to be said of that. I'd love to see more grassroots efforts in China. Regardless, West is not perfect. Never has been. To Robert's point about the ice, water, gas, I think that that's something pretty serious that we should talk about. And I think Duncan brought up a good point of basically the way I'd summarize a little bit of what Duncan was mentioning is to what end? So we should get AGI right. To what end? We should make sure these bad things don't happen. To what end? And it might be the case that at some point there are moral patience and grand intelligences potentially as far beyond we as we are beyond the nematodes, which experience a lot of rich and wonderful things and whose blossoming and blooming forth at some point, maybe if we can ensure our own safety in the process, a hypothetical world, would sort of not necessarily be and ill. Very few of us on this call are like, oh, it's so crappy that humans evolved. We should still be sea snails and we'd have a way better Zoom call. Obviously we wouldn't. We wouldn't have a Zoom call. And so I think there is something to be said of to what end and leaving open space for what are those positive longer term futures. to what Robert said, I think there is some truth to, hey, some of this is just in the hand of the labs over here. Like it's going from water to gas just because these goddamn labs over here. What the hell's going on? Yeah, I think we should keep those labs in check. I think they should be absolutely accountable. I think that much more than just the labs alone should be steering the ship. I've been saying that from the moment I opened my mouth on this call and for 10 years before opening my mouth on this call, in more podcasts and articles than you could shake a dozen sticks at. But I would also say that I'm not sure that the transition from ice to water and water to gas is driven only by a fistful of companies. There seems to potentially be a process of life that seems to be doing a thing. It seems to be doing a blossoming of the set of total powers and access to nature and reach to keep sort of the process itself alive. I'm not necessarily calling it good in all manifests. I'm not saying it should be unbridled and released in every direction all the time. But I am saying there might be something more than the labs going on. There might be something about nature and about the swell of this great flame of life of which we are part, which we should consider the trajectory of, because I doubt it can be frozen. But I think we should consider its trajectory, to Duncan's point. So I think there's more to it than the labs, although they should be held accountable. I think it would be really, really self-deceptive to say, no matter how many countless billions of years, going water skiing and watching good television shows, et cetera, would sort of be the height of all possible sentient experience. I suspect there could be more going on. I suspect long enough term there ought to be. How should we get there? Well, we'll probably have to talk about that after safety. But I don't think we can avoid that in the long term.
If this had been a meeting of London Futurists in Birkbeck College, as in the old days, I might have interrupted you there, but Dan has said, hey, this is such a big discussion. Let's wait until we're in the pub and we'll discuss it properly there.
Yeah.
Well, we are going to have a sort of pub follow-up. Some of us who are still here after the end of the discussion, so that might be a topic to pick up for those who don't have to rush off and do other things. Duncan, what would you like to finish with?
Okay, super. Well, just again, huge thanks for organizing this and to all the participants and to all of you for tuning in. Yeah, three points. I think the first one is that I think we want the least possible regulation and the least possible international coordination that is necessary and sufficient to get the job done. Obviously, we want to be very careful about creating regulations that would stifle beneficial innovation. We want as much of that innovation to happen as we can without going over a cliff into areas that really pose harms that we're just not willing to accept. I think we also want, a lot of diversity in how different parts of society, different countries respond to these issues, navigate their way through AI, find out how to, make it most benefit their goals. But there are at the same time a few issues where we will need regulation. I mean, this is the most powerful technology that humanity's ever created. It is a dual-use technology like many others, or multiple-use technology, and it does have the potential for harm. It will need to be regulated, and not to avoid all risk, but to bring risk within manageable parameters. And there are certain elements of that, of really managing the future of AI that can only be achieved successfully through cooperating with others. So I think let's keep that in mind. My second related point is just an encouragement for all of those working in this space to remember to think global. Many countries around the world now, mine included, are focusing very heavily on what we need to do at the domestic level to really accelerate our ability to adopt AI and to draw the tremendous benefits it brings. And this crucial work, whether it's here building out the sovereign AI stack or really enabling one's population to be having access to these tools and to be turning that into productive benefit, that kind of work is crucial. Under adoption of AI, of safe and reliable AI tools would be a tremendous waste and a missed opportunity. At the same time, it may turn out that some of the ways that AI can most affect your population, particularly in the long term, not that distant long term, the next few years, may be issues that you can only handle by working with others around the world. And so I think that if you are in that space of focusing on AI and AI policy, do not lose track of the future scenarios and what they could bring, and the necessity that creates to work together around the world. Most countries are not going to be building AGI or ASI in the next few years, and even those who are have a shared interest in working together to making sure that that goes well and is managed successfully. And then I guess a final point would just be a call to action for anyone listening here about your role. This is going to be one of the most important challenges we face, and one of the most complex and difficult ones. We're dealing with a technology that's moving extremely quickly, faster than I think many of us are comfortable with. We need to bring a tremendous amount of expertise to the table to address that at many levels, but not least of which is the innovation and the learning from the best of past experience, and the challenging past experience to think of new solutions as well in terms of the international coordination piece. So if you are in that space, if you know others who are in it, I encourage you to get involved. We're going to need all the great minds on this in the next few months and years that we can.
We're going to need lots of minds, but we're going to need diverse insights as well. I noticed that Melissa has been gently scolding us in the chat for maybe not having enough diversity in the AI safety community. She says there's a little bit too many EAs, effective altruists, perhaps. I wonder if we can bring in more of these alternative views, or maybe we are alternative enough. Nora, final thoughts from you. Sorry, I've jumped the queue. I'm getting ahead of myself. I'll let you mull on that, Nora, and I'll let Robert have a go as well.
Okay. Just to come back on Dan's final sort of point about the evolution through to the vapor, and I was not in any way saying that we should not consider at some point moving to a more developed phase, moving to AGI, even moving to ASI. But we should consider, we should debate, it should be a conscious move. And the crucial thing, we should not allow ourselves currently to be led by the nose to an existence we have not chosen, an existence that has not been thought through, and an existence that threatens human flourishing. We need to cooperate rather than race towards a cliff edge, but that cooperation should not be in order to get AGI and superintelligence as quickly as possible. It should be to move onto a more advanced AI when we understand what we're doing, we have considered the likely implications of those actions, and we are satisfied that they will lead to an increase in human flourishing.
Well said. Nora.
My turn. Cool. Okay, I'll keep it brief, but I think I want to second some of what Duncan said about I'd mostly love there to be as much innovation as possible within the bounds of there's some extreme risks that are sort of that could be or might be irrecoverable, and those are really in the interest of no one. So I think a focus on those extreme risks is justified because of that. I recently I've been thinking a lot about this notion of resilience, where resilience is specifically the idea of look, we don't have to get rid of all the possible harms that could ever happen, because we probably can't carve that line so in such nuanced way, but we would actually get rid of a bunch of sort of upside potential as well. We should be focusing definitely, not exclusively, but definitely on sort of the more irrevocable, more catastrophic risks. The last thing I want to flag here is that I think an important investment at this point, given this frame, is also something like contingency planning, or, you know, going back to the nuclear analogy, what's the red phone that we have if something goes actually faster or more drastically wrong with AI than we currently expect it? Because within those many plausible scenarios, given our uncertainty, some of them are really pretty fast, and people who've thought seriously about this and have access to a lot of relevant information are worried about some of the really fast tracks. So contingency planning, I think, is another space that is actually somewhat susceptible to international collaboration as well. Yeah.
I'm a big fan of the conditionality idea, that rather than getting countries or companies to sign up to do something definitely now, they can sign up to do something if various other circumstances happen in the future. So they may say they don't think such and such a thing's ever going to happen, but they may be prepared to sign, well, if a canary signal does go off, they will make a change. So contingency planning, and I like the idea of a red phone. I haven't thought of that before. My final thought here is actually I'm leaving this conversation reasonably optimistic, because although, my goodness, there's a lot of problems ahead, there is a lot of different groups working thoughtfully and by and large joined up, maybe not as joined up as we could be. Maybe we are sometimes reinventing the wheel, but there's a lot of people who've been in this game for quite a while, and I think there are reasonable starting grounds for solutions. We've by no means explored them as fully as maybe in another version of this webinar we might have done, but I think there's enough to maybe say some of us should come back another time and dig more deeply into this. And having said that, I would thank Sean, except he's had to dash off already for real world issues. I'm definitely thanking the panelists. I thank the people who've been contributing in chat and in the questions. And here's to accelerating wise regulations, the least possible regulations that will maximize innovation but not take us too close to the sun. Thanks very much, everybody.
Very good.